So many films and so little time. Might as well get to it.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast, where we discuss the world of film from a fresh angle. And now your host, Robert Yaniz Jr.
Welcome to the Crooked Table Podcast. This is Rob. It's been a minute, you guys. I know Freddie and I last talked about The Defenders a week or so ago, which was in and of itself a much delayed episode that we've been meaning to do for a while. And now here I am with what I'm going to call my catch-up episode, hence the title. So it's been about a month and a half, I'd say, maybe, since I've kind of dropped the ball on doing weekly episodes. Maybe, actually, now we're getting probably close to 2 months. So in that time, mostly throughout September, there were a lot of really high-profile films that I didn't really get a chance to touch base on. So this is my episode where I'm basically just going to discuss the 3 main films from last month. It's in the interim, since I've had a regular episode. Just kind of review them back to back to back. Really, not fast, but in quick succession, to kind of get back up to speed with the films that have been out in the last few weeks. And then next episode, I will devote the time specifically to Blade Runner 2049, which I did see and I have thoughts on, obviously, because I have thoughts on everything. I mean, let's break it down. So before we get into that, there's been so much going on in my life. Obviously, professionally, I've been sort of away from this. I've had a lot of other freelance work kind of on my plate, a big project that I was dealing with that. And then in a more personal level, you may have heard, you guys probably know that I live in Florida, that there was some hurricane situations occurring, and that was fun to deal with. And Kai and I lost power for a few days, so there was a lot of running around to in-laws' homes and trying to take care of our infant daughter. And then she had a cold afterwards, where it was like a stomach issue. So it's been a big mess. Needless to say, I'm trying to make a concerted effort to get back on that weekly pace that I was on, because I do miss doing this. And, now we're going into a bunch of really big holiday season films with November, December, The Last Jedi, Thor Ragnarok, Justice League. So there's definitely big things that I want to talk about, as well as a lot of smaller Oscar fare that is sort of on the horizon that I'm really looking forward to seeing. So anyway, that's all future episodes. For this episode, we're going to be talking about 3 films in specifically. We're going to be talking about one that I loved, one that I liked, and one that I'm very mixed on. And if you have any idea what 3 they are, just by the description of this episode or the image that's accompanying it, you probably have a pretty good idea of which one I'm mixed on. So without further ado, let's go into my review first of It.
I saw something. There was this clown.
Yeah, I saw him too. Bill, if you'll come with me, you'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too. You'll float too.
As always with these reviews, we're going to be talking about the hype, the story, the cast, the production, and the verdict. So as for It, going into this film, as far as the hype, I was excited to see this. I was a fan of the miniseries from 1990 back in the day, although I had heard that it didn't age very well. I'm actually still in the process of rewatching it for the first time in, I don't know, probably a couple decades at least. I loved Tim Curry's performance as Pennywise, and that's basically, I feel like most people, that's kind of the main thing that I remembered from it. Everything else was sort of blurry, and I was like, oh, John Ritter's there, and Harry Anderson, and all these big TV stars of the time. But I haven't read the book. I own a copy of the book that I've been meaning to read for years, and now that I've seen this movie, I probably will get to that. But I did have a very well regard for this story. Specifically, I have seen a lot of Stephen King's film adaptations, but some of the main ones, like The Dead Zone and Pet Sematary, are still on my blind spot list that I definitely want to get to. So going into it, I'd seen the trailers and I'd heard that it was, supposedly really terrifying, and I, wasn't too, I'm not one of these people that's like shied away from it specifically because I have a fear of clowns or anything, because I do enjoy this sort of Goonies / Stand By Me / Monster Squad vibe of the story, especially about the little kids facing this supernatural force in the form of Pennywise. So I was very excited to see how that was going to play out on screen, and I'd heard nothing but rave reviews going into this. So, that being said, that was what was in my mind. I had high expectations going into it, and let's get into the story. The story here, of course, is one half of the, 1,100-page Stephen King novel. This film specifically focuses on the Losers Club when they are children, where the sequel, which has now been announced for September, I don't remember, I feel like it's September 6th, 2019, will focus on Pennywise's return 27 years later, and the reunion of the Losers Club as they take him on, realizing that he's back. And spoilers, I guess. If you know that there's a second film coming, it shouldn't be a spoiler that Pennywise comes back. But I was really impressed with this tone. It did feel to me like a film that came right out of the late 80s, which is where, the setting of this was. They updated the setting from the novel, and the miniseries for the kids side of it from the 50s to the 80s, so that, we would move into modern time with the 27-year time jump. And I did specifically like the fact that it's been 27 years since they did the miniseries. I thought that was kind of a cool meta commentary that makes the whole experience a little more chilling, unintentionally so, I'm sure. But so the story is pretty straightforward. These kids are all tormented by their own personal trauma and kind of come together to face a school bully, as well as, of course, Pennywise the clown. What I like about this story so much is the authenticity with the time period, and the fact that like the best sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, it really focuses on using Pennywise and that demonic force that he is as a sort of metaphor for kids dealing with adolescence and dealing with, an upsetting home life or prejudice in their life or tragedy in their family. And I think that the subtext there makes the film a lot richer than just your average monster movie. I think the direction by Andy Muschietti, I'm not exactly sure how, Muschietti, is really top notch. I was a moderate fan of his previous film, Mama. I thought it was an interesting debut. I had most of my issues with it were based in the story, not so much the look or the atmosphere. So the fact that this story is already sort of laid out and well adapted in this version, I think that his directorial style is I think this film basically proves that he is probably at the top of his game. And now with this, I would put him up there. Excuse me. I would put him up there with Fede Alvarez and Jennifer Kent and Robert Eggers, who have come up with some of the most interesting visually horror films. And to me, they represent sort of the top notch of the post James Wan era of horror filmmakers. So the story here was definitely a lot for him to work with, and I think he executed it to a T. Going into the cast, when you have a film that's entirely led by children, like this first half of it really is, I think you kind of live or die based on the cast that you have. And I thought that in this particular version, the cast knocked it out of the park. I was really impressed with this. I wasn't really familiar with almost any of these actors. I know that, Finn, whatever, I have to find his name, hold on a second. I knew that one of them is from Stranger Things, which I still have not caught up with. Finn Wolfhard, there it is. But I was only familiar really with Jaden Lieberher, who I saw in Midnight Special, and I thought he was really good in that. And I actually knew that he was in this going into it, and then kind of forgot as I was watching the movie. I was like, who the hell is this kid playing Bill? He's great. And like, no wonder, because I've seen him in other things, and he was great in other films as well. But everyone from Wolfhard to Lieberher to Jeremy Ray Taylor as Ben, Jack Dylan Grazer as Eddie, all of them were really great. To me, the standout was probably Sophia Lillis as Bev, who I wasn't really familiar with her at all. I do feel like Chosen Jacobs and Wyatt Olaf are sort of left hanging here. I didn't feel like they had too much to do as Mike and Stan, respectively. As far as Stan, if you know anything about the book, I feel like his sort of underdevelopment here, I guess, kind of makes sense. But I feel that for the most part, with those 5 characters, the 5 of the 7 that are given more substantive roles, I felt like those child actors did such a phenomenal job. And they didn't really feel like they were acting. They felt real in the moment, real kids, talking like real kids. Yes, real kids do curse. And they really sold me on this sort of fantastical concept. Of course, I can't mention the cast without talking about Bill Skarsgård as Pennywise, who brings a real sense of menace and darkness to the role that I think is very different than what Tim Curry brought to it. Tim Curry's was more playful, more sadistic in some ways, but also less threatening, I think. As a kid, I found Tim Curry's version really scary. As an adult, not so much. I find him fun to watch, and he's entertaining as hell. But I don't think he has the same kind of otherworldly presence that Bill Skarsgård brings to the role. I compare it sort of to the Joker, which is another famous killer clown, obviously. Jack Nicholson's performance in Batman '89 is unforgettable, and he's great as that character. He's fun as hell to watch, but he's not really scary. You don't walk out of that movie being like, oh my god, Nicholson was terrifying. He's more just like, this guy's kind of a maniac clown. Okay, whatever. Whereas Heath Ledger was a little more chilling, a little more visceral, and a lot darker in multiple respects. And I feel like Bill Skarsgård's Pennywise really kind of counters Tim Curry's in that very same way. Going into the production, I already mentioned here, I think Muschietti's atmosphere and the production value in this film is incredible. I know it was only made for, I think, like $35 million, and it's made over $500 million worldwide at this point, which is unbelievable. And I couldn't. I didn't see that coming. I knew that the film was going to do well because there's a lot of name recognition with the story, with Stephen King in general. But I had no idea that it was going to do this well. In fact, I sort of wondered if The Dark Tower's failure may have sullied the Stephen King branding in the short term. But I guess I was wrong, and I couldn't be happier about that. I feel like the film, from the direction to the screenplay by Chase Palmer, Cary Fukunaga, who was going to direct it at one point and dropped out, and Gary Dauberman, I thought really crystallized that story. And in a lot of ways, it's a very simple story about these kids facing this creature. But in a lot of ways, it's more, like I said, it has a lot of subtext, and it's rich in multiple ways. And I think that comes to the surface and elevates this material. The score by Benjamin Wallfisch is really evocative and creepy in the best ways, and in that way really complements the story. It feels like one of those films that costs $35 million, but it feels like it's expensive studio. It feels like an expensive studio horror film, and in a way, I guess it is, because it is Warner Brothers. But it's also at $35 million. Every sense of that is on screen here. This director is only his second feature-length film, really, I think, and he's already delivered a $500 million global hit. So, needless to say, I think that it looks spectacular and it's shot really well, and it feels a lot more cinematic, obviously, than the TV miniseries, but it's jarring in a way. If you watch the opening sequence in this film with Georgie and the counterpart in the TV version, you can really tell. It really highlights how terribly and poorly made the miniseries was and how blandly it was shot versus how Machete, I have to figure that out, how he shoots this, it elevates even simple things like a little kid running down the street. And yeah, the violence in this movie is there. Obviously, it's very apparent and kind of in your face at times. But even that is presented in such it's a very artistic, stylistic way. So moving into the verdict, in case you can't tell by now, I have very few complaints about this movie. I love this film. I thought it was great. Of the three that I told you I was going to talk about, this is the one that I loved. And I'm looking forward to owning it on Blu-ray and watching it again and introducing it to Kai and checking out the sequel, which I am also really excited to see. Stephen King is kind of experiencing a little bit of a renaissance right now as a brand, and I think this film, which is one of his most popular books and properties in general, is definitely leading the way. So I will definitely give this, as far as my verdict, 4.5 out of 5. Not necessarily a perfect film, but it's pretty damn close. I found myself really kind of lost in the narrative of it all, and rooting for these kids in a very palpable way, you know, while I connected to their individual stories as well. I also have to mention the sort of school-age bully in this film. I think that character of Henry Bowers is maybe just as scary, if not more so. Actually, probably more so than Pennywise himself. And the actor Nicholas Hamilton, who plays him, brought a lot to that character, and grounds the film. And like what I said, it's not just a fantastical story. There are other more grounded elements at play here as well. So that's my review of it. Moving into the following week, that came out September 8th. September 15th, I believe, we got Mother, the new film from Darren Aronofsky, starring Jennifer Lawrence and Javier Bardem. So let's get into our review of Mother.
Please, come in. Hello.
Hello. He's a stranger. We're just gonna let him sleep in our house. Hello.
Hello.
Did you know he had a wife? He has pictures of you in his luggage.
What were you doing in their luggage?
Wow, man, I don't even know where to go with this one. So, in case you probably... this is the one of the three that I'm very mixed on. Going into Darren Aronofsky's Mother, as far as the hype is concerned, I was a big fan of Black Swan. I was a big fan of The Wrestler. I've been very mixed to negative on Noah, The Fountain. And then I appreciated Requiem for a Dream, though it's not a film I have any interest in seeing a second time, just because it is an experience. And I kind of feel the same about Mother. So going into this one, I was, I've seen all of his previous films, Aronofsky, and I appreciated his talent. I did think that I knew that he had a tendency to maybe overdo his points and beat them in the head a little bit too much. And so, that being said, I was still curious to see the film. I knew that it was polarizing, and I, just wanted to kind of experience it for myself. And the fact that the trailer is very vague, that the film was supposedly open to all of these interpretations and all of that, just really intrigued me. So I was definitely interested in seeing it and kind of forming my own opinion. As far as the story, without getting into spoilers, there's a lot that I'm not going to address. The film just basically centers on a writer, a poet actually, played by Javier Bardem, and his young wife, played by Jennifer Lawrence, and they live in this idyllic house that Lawrence has been working really hard to restore after a fire destroyed everything. And they begin to get a series of uninvited guests, that played by Ed Harris, Michelle Pfeiffer, and it really just kind of spirals out from there. That's pretty much all the trailer tells you. And I think if anyone is going to enjoy this movie, it is going to be because you don't know that much about it going in. Plot-wise, that's pretty much all I knew. I had heard some of the interpretation that it's about the artist's struggle, or it's some kind of a biblical allegory. And there's a lot. I mean, I lean towards. I know that the latter is there, but I tend to connect more to the former, being a writer, being a creative person, and knowing some of Darren Aronofsky's history and his his personal life. I think you can watch this and pretty easily sort of read into what he's trying to get across with this film, what he's expressing, and what he's trying to get off his chest. Does the story work for me? Nah, that's a gray area. That's a question that it depends on how I feel about it in the moment. Going into the cast, Javier Bardem is outstanding in this, of course. He's kind of good in everything. Jennifer Lawrence really holds it down, even though I feel like this character is very passive, and it did feel jarring to me that she's usually such an active character, whether she's Mystique or Katniss Everdeen or Silver Linings Playbook. I know her character's not Silver Linings Playbook. I'm just blanking on her character's name in that from at the moment. She's usually such a passionate, active character. It kind of seems how she is in real life. And in this film, she's very subservient. She's very kind of laid back and doting wife type. And that was very jarring for me. I think that might be what Aronofsky is going for with her performance, with casting her in this. But I think that she does a really good job here for the most part. It's not so much any of the performances that affected my enjoyment of the film. It's not so much the directorial style. Aronofsky's material always tends to be very surreal, very sort of heightened and visceral. And I use that with it, but I think it's even more visceral with this film. And intense. And I think that the performances that are all in here from the Bardem and Lawrence, as well as Pfeiffer and Harris, I think they all really support Aronofsky's vision. I think he has a very clear message he's trying to get across, and a very clear idea for how he wants to do that. And the actors all serve their roles really well. But ultimately, they're not really, even Lawrence is not really the star of this film. The star of this film is it's not even really a story. It's the metaphor of it all. It's the theme and the point of it is the star of the film. And if you connect to that, or if you find that engaging and thought-provoking in any way, you're going to enjoy the film on some level. That being said, moving into the production, I did say that the film was well directed, the visuals are all strong, the score, blah, 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 all that stuff, it's well shot. What my issue is with the film is that I do feel like, and I've heard other critics say this as well, I do feel like he goes too far with what he's trying to get across. I do feel like there's a very specific moment towards the end, and anyone that's seen this film knows exactly what I'm talking about, where I was very turned off and hoping they weren't going to take it there, but kind of figuring they were probably going to take it there. And it just, to me, felt gratuitous and borderline exploitative. And there's a lot of things in this film that, you've been the first half sort of wondering, okay, this is kind of an intriguing kind of, bottled thriller, very Hitchcock style. And then the second half, it goes off the rails, and, what's happening in this house starts to make less and less sense until it really comes to a head. And then, I could see a lot of people walking out of this feeling totally unfulfilled and wondering, what the fuck did I just watch? Demanding their money back, that kind of thing. Because this is not a film that is made for general audiences. I think none of Aronofsky's films really are, but Black Swan, which I loved, like I said, is very much more straightforward than this. It's also, I think, more accessible than this film. I think it's more mainstream in a lot of ways, and I think this is probably one of Aronofsky's most polarizing films. I mean, if you read reviews, people either love this thing or they hate it, and I don't know where it is quite on Rotten Tomatoes, but it tends to get a very, divisive response from people, which is understandable. If you're an average moviegoer, I would not recommend bothering with this because it's probably not for you. If you've never heard of Aronofsky and you're not really, you don't want something that challenges you, that will go out of its way to either enrage or get a reaction out of you, then this is not a film for you. I'm 68% on Rotten Tomatoes. I wanted to check. So I guess critics, for the most part, are borderline. Most critics are enjoying it and appreciating it on some level. But even those that like the film, I've seen a lot of reviews saying, yeah, good film, I like what he's going for, and don't want to watch it again anymore. It's very Requiem for a Dream in that way. I've seen Black Swan a few times, so I don't feel that way about that film, which is his biggest success to date as well. But so Mother was an interesting film to watch, and it gave me a really great story to tell Kai when I came back. Like, I just saw the most fucked up movie. Sit down, let me tell you a story. And immediately after I told her that, I said, "Is this a film? Sounds like a film you're interested in seeing." She's like, "Yeah, no, not at all. Not based on that." Because she's not, it's not one of those films that you watch to be entertained. It's one of those films you watch to maybe talk about, maybe study, maybe think about, and try and dissect. And in some ways, Blade Runner, which I'll talk about on the next episode of this podcast, is kind of a similar, has a similar intent. Blade Runner is not a film that is necessarily entertaining to watch. Blade Runner is a film that you want to watch and then read a paper about it, or write a paper about it, and be like, well, I think the replicants represent this, or I think that this is commenting on this part of our society, and I think that the filmmaker was, trying to send this specific type of message. And Mother is very much, as people have been saying, an allegorical film in that way. Going into the verdict, never want to see this film again. Did I enjoy watching it? Parts of it I found intriguing, and then afterwards, the message that I took away from it, like I said, the biblical stuff was fine. I'm not a particularly religious person, so that's, that is what it is. That is the interpretation that the filmmaker is choosing to focus on. I tend to think the struggling artist part of it is more intriguing to me, and it paints a very sort of negative picture of that perspective on things. But I can see people loving this movie. I can see people hating this movie. For me, I kind of fall right in the middle because I recognize the artistry in what he's trying to do. I recognize how well the film is directed and how in a way brilliant it is. I just don't think it really resonated with me in that way as that it does for some people. So for me, I'm kind of stuck between like a 2.5 and a 3 out of 5, just because I did get such a mixed reaction to it. For me, you need to basically not outwardly turn me off and have at least some kind of entertainment value in order for me to appreciate the deeper levels of what your film is trying to do. And for me, this film, like I said, drastically turned me off in its final 15 minutes or whatever, and wasn't a particularly entertaining film to watch, other than just trying to figure out what the fuck is happening. It's not a film that for me I really want to revisit, even though there are other things you can glean from the story if you look deeper, I'm sure. It's just not really the kind of film that I particularly want to look deeper into. So those are my thoughts on Mother. And that came out September 15th, as we're kind of tracing our way through the month. And the following week, we found a very different film on the horizon on September 22nd. So let's get into our review of Kingsman, The Golden Circle.
Today marks the beginning of a new age. Wait, I'm going to show you. Say goodbye to the Kingsman.
Kind of got a bit of a save the world situation here.
Welcome to Statesman.
As your American cousins, we'll be working side by side.
Let's get started.
kind of a relief after 2 quasi-horror films. I wouldn't really consider Mother a horror film, more of a psychological thriller / cinematic mindfuck. But Kingsman: The Golden Circle. So going into this one, as far as the hype is concerned, I loved the first Kingsman. I know that there is a lot of controversy involving a certain anal sex joke towards the end. And I understand the perspective on that. I kind of read it more the way that the filmmaker intended, the way Matthew Vaughn has explained it. But, that controversy aside, I was really excited to see this, and I was hoping that it could provide a worthy follow-up to Kingsman: The Secret Service. The fact that we had director Matthew Vaughn coming back after he passed on the sequels to X-Men First Class, or got pushed out of it, depending what reports you believe, by Bryan Singer's return, as well as Kick-Ass 2, which he stepped away from, and if that was the script he was working with, well done, Mr. Vaughn. The fact that he sort of decided to own this as his franchise, I think made me even more excited, because I did like Stardust, I did like X-Men, like I just mentioned, First Class, as well as Kick-Ass. And he has a really solid track record for me. I think the only movie I haven't seen is Layer Cake, which I have picked up on DVD a million years ago and still have sitting somewhere in my house. So I was excited to see this. I thought that this franchise offers sort of a wacky, like anything goes, like blatantly shameless R-rated spectacle take on James Bond franchise. And I think this film takes that and sort of runs with it in many ways. Going into the story here, so this is not a spoiler because it's in the trailers, finds the Kingsman pretty much destroyed with the exception of Eggsy and Merlin, and I won't get into spoilers on who all survives and all that, but they have to reach out to the Statesman, which is basically the American equivalent of the Kingsman. And there's a bunch of famous faces that show up here to fill out that lineup. All the while, the two organizations kind of band together to take down the person responsible for the Kingsman's destruction, a drug-dealing kingpin known as Poppy, played by Julianne Moore. So there's a lot of subplots going on in this film, unfortunately, that I think do bog it down. There's some stuff going on with the Statesmen themselves. There's an entire sort of relationship that Eggsy, played by Taron Egerton, finds himself in. There is the return of a couple of film characters from the first film, one of which is featured very heavily in all the marketing, and I kind of wish that he wasn't. There is another sort of B-level love story. There are other characters that they try to develop sort of half-heartedly, and it doesn't entirely work. But from a story perspective, this is not a film you go in expecting a groundbreaking story. It's the execution that really, I think, makes it work. And the fact that Poppy's plan involves, her own drug supply, and I won't get into the details of it, but it does raise some sort of political issues in a way that the first film also does with technology, with Samuel L. Jackson and his sort of, taking advantage of cell phones and SIM cards and using them to control people and that kind of thing. I think there is sort of a social commentary happening in this film that you don't normally get from movies like this, and I think that's kind of interesting. The movie doesn't really concern itself with elaborating much on that. It's just kind of set dressing, but it is nice that it's there, and it adds a little more texture to the film itself. As far as the cast is concerned, Egerton is, again, really fun in this movie. I think he's got a certain kind of charm. Kai and I both loved the first movie, and I think his performance as a sort of street kid turned super suave spy is a big part of what makes this franchise work. Mark Strong, of course, is coming back as Merlin. I already mentioned Merlin. And I think he's sort of a underrated actor. I've thought he was great in all the Matthew Vaughn movies that he's appeared in. He was in, of course, the first Kingsman, then also in Kick-Ass, where I thought he was great there. I actually thought he was probably the only really, or at least the best part of the terrible Green Lantern movie that came out a few years ago, as Sinestro. I kind of wanted to see him come back to play Sinestro, or maybe be cast as Lex Luthor instead of Jesse Eisenberg, because nobody saw that casting coming. But he's great here as well. Some of these statesman people, I feel like, are the ones that are underused. Channing Tatum is barely in this movie. Jeff Bridges is barely in this movie. Halle Berry is barely in this movie. I think that, for some of that, it was scheduling was the issue. That you have all these A-list actors, and they're only in a couple scenes here and there. Matthew Vaughn has said that in a third film, if they do get a third film, I don't know. I know this film is sort of struggling a little more at the box office than the first one did. I think that if that was to happen, I think we would see a lot more of the statesman. Pedro Pascal as Whiskey is really the only one of these characters that really gets a substantive role and at least even a modicum of development. And he was fun to watch. The whole thing with the whip and all the cowboy stuff going on with the statesmen and their the fact that their cover, spoilers, not really, is sort of a liquor industry, just like for Kingsman, it's their tailor shop. I think all of the not exposition, but all of the background stuff on the statesman is fun. I feel like this film takes on way too much. I feel like if they had introduced statesmen here, maybe the small way, and then had them be a major part of the third one, maybe that would have worked. But this film has a lot of work to do and a lot of story to get through. And even though at like 2 hours and 20 minutes, I still feel like some of it feels rushed and overdone. Like, I think you could have taken, I'm just going to say it, that character that comes back, the one that you all know that comes back, that I'm trying not to mention because I'm trying to preserve a surprise that the marketing team at Fox apparently didn't want to preserve. I think that he should have not been brought back in this movie. If you want, do like a Pirates of the Caribbean style thing with the Pirates of the Caribbean trilogy, the first three, and have him sort of come back at the end of the second film and then play a big role in the third film or something. I think having him come back and the way that affects the storyline and how it sort of takes over the movie for large chunks of it, I think it is too much, and it deals with some really, really overdone cliches that I'm really kind of sick of dealing with in comic book movies. As far as the production is concerned, I think there's a real sense of style and sort of bonkers tone that Matthew Vaughn and his team bring to these movies, which makes them a lot of fun to watch. I do think that his sort of his style of shooting action scenes, like in the church scene in the first film, he sort of zooms the camera from one spot to the next, creating kind of an illusion of a one-shot action sequence by cutting things together in a certain way using digital effects and stuff. He does that several times in this movie, and I remember even saying to Kai after we saw this that was too much. It got sort of tiresome after a while and kind of exhausting to watch, and you should not be feeling like the action scenes in your ridiculous comic book spy movie are tiring to watch. It shouldn't feel repetitive, but it sort of did come to that point. There are also parts in this film that are so intended for shock value and just to mess with the audience. The beginning scene with with Poppy's test for her henchmen comes to mind. That famous, again, another controversial sort of sex joke or a scene or whatever in this film, which again I also didn't. I mean, I could see how these movies are not the most flattering towards women. There's a lot of arguments for that, about how, in the first film, the character of Roxy is really underused, and then, of course, the princess in the first one, and I feel like there's definitely some truth to that. These films are not doing their hardest job of representing women, and I think Halle Berry's character could have been a step in that direction if it had not been bogged down by the 14 other subplots that the film had to deal with. But, you know, I think in that scene that's happening in this movie, the controversial scene, again, I'm trying to stay away from details. It actually, to me, felt that one shot was a little, what are we doing here? This is kind of ridiculous, or a little too much. But the conversation that precedes that moment, I think was, in a way, had a lot of heart to it. And I think was sort of the film's way of saying, yeah, we have all this crazy shit going on, but we're trying to underline that with like a real sort of emotional grasp to it. You know, whether that works or not, you know, I understand it doesn't 100% even work for me, but the intentionality is there to try and create something that's not just, you know, your James Bond traveling around the world, you know, having sex with women and all over the place and doing as he pleases with them, very, very objectifying to women, were those films, which I guess we're kind of used to it in those movies more, and Kingsman's a newer franchise, so these kind of bear the brunt of that criticism a lot more. I guess that must be what it is, because there are things happening in Spectre and Skyfall that I didn't hear this much hubbub about, but as soon as Kingsman comes out and tries to sort of comment on that, people seem really offended, and I don't quite understand how you can be offended by one thing and not by the other. That being said, the production, you know, Vaughn's way of shooting action was kind of ridiculous and overdone at times. Going back to the performances for a second, I forgot to pinpoint Julianne Moore is definitely the VIP of this movie for me. I thought she was a really strong villain. I actually would love to see more of her here. She's sort of isolated in a way, both, you know, physically from the rest of the film and also sort of narratively until kind of the third act. And I would have loved to have seen a little more involvement for her as far as, you know, Elton John, who's in this movie, and it's not a spoiler because his name's on the poster. I feel like that gag, they beat it over the head, and we got that same joke about 5 to 7 times. And I think maybe 3 to 5 times would have been plenty. So I think that this movie is not, you know, the Kingsman movies are never subtle, but some of the gags in the script and some of the stylistic moves that made the first movie so charming are way overbearing. The story feels too overloaded with multiple plot threads, and you know, I think that it is pretty much subpar to the first movie on just about every level. That being said, going into the verdict, I did still think Kingsman: The Golden Circle was a lot of fun. For what it is. It was much more disposable than the first movie, but the performances from Julianne Moore and Taron Egerton specifically, the world building here, what they're trying to establish with the statesman, and some of the cool action beats, as well as some of the gags, even the Elton John ones, I thought was really strong, and you know, made for a fun time at the movies. Is it one of those that's going to end up in my top 10 of the year? Hell no. It's not on my top 10 of the year now. So it's not even close to there. It's not even close to being the sort of release that I thought the first one was, where it really almost transcended the genre in a way. And, you know, kind of elevated comic book and spy movies kind of in one fell swoop to something sort of outrageous and that felt fresh. This movie didn't have any of that novelty going for it, which is, you know, I think it's sort of par for the course with sequels in general. But I think The Golden Circle could have been a much better movie had they decided to break its main, you know, some of its subplots up into, you know, the second and third film. I think maybe Matthew Vaughn was not really wanting to, and the studio not really wanting to count on the fact that there would be a third film. And the way things are going, there might not be. I'd still recommend Kingsman: The Golden Circle, especially for fans of the Kingsman: The Secret Service, because both films are are fun to watch and entertaining for a certain segment of the audience that can deal with the kind of shock value and in-your-facedness, as I make up a word on the spot, that has kind of become their trademark. So I'm still going to give Kingsman: The Golden Circle a 3.5 out of 5. I could almost give it a 3, but it's like, there was enough stuff in there, and I had enough residual love from the first one that I'm willing to bump it to a 3.5. So those are my thoughts on It, Mother, and Kingsman: The Golden Circle. Obviously, I would highly recommend It the most of these three. That one is probably guaranteed to fit on my top 10 of the year. Mother, less so, unless you're into that kind of thing, or unless you're a cinephile. I would probably just skip Mother. And Kingsman: The Golden Circle is much more, is definitely the most broad appeal of the three. So if you like the first one, check it out. If you didn't like the first one, don't bother, because it's like the first one, only not as strong in any way. So those are my thoughts on those three films. Now that I'm finally starting to catch up here, a little bit longer than usual episode as far as my solo ones go on the Crooked Table podcast. I'm just glad that I finally got the chance to talk about all of those, because I've been wanting to for a while, and there's probably much more I could say about all three, especially Mother, just because there's a lot to dissect. But I wanted to do kind of a spoiler-free just overview, and like, these are the films I saw, this is what I thought of them. So that's finally now out there into the world. So that's all I have for now. You can rate and review the Crooked Table podcast on iTunes if you'd be so kind. We're also on Stitcher. You can follow me, Robert Yaniz Jr., at Crooked Table on Twitter. We're also on Facebook and the other social medias. You can find more podcasts, reviews, videos, and other movie-related goodies at crookedtable.com. On the next episode, as I mentioned a couple times, we're going to talk Blade Runner 2049. I'm really excited to talk about that with you guys. I know that that review will be coming a little bit later. I'm going to try and get it up by Monday at the latest, and maybe even tie in some Last Jedi trailer response or reaction. And who knows, I might end up seeing something else in the meantime, like The Foreigner, so I can maybe tie that into that episode as well. Until then, I've been Rob. We'll catch you around the table next week. Roll credits.
This has been a production of crookedtable.com. All rights reserved.
CROOKED.